to ask me anything, thanks to everybody who has sent their questions in via social media. My wife will be reading out the questions. Okay, let's go.
Hans Mantel. When we start going down to ever smaller distances and we get near the size of the atom, at which point does gravity no longer work?
That's a good question. But we think there's actually a scale much smaller than atoms, very much smaller than atoms, at which gravity doesn't work. In fact, none of our theories of physics actually work. When you look at a small region of space, that small space is associated with an uncertainty in energy. This is called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And if we had a super microscope and we zoomed in on smaller and smaller regions of space, we would find that there would be a greater uncertainty in how much energy was contained in that region. Now, energy is associated with mass through E equals mc squared. So, in effect, when we get to very tiny scales, we can conjure out of the vacuum, out of nothing, mass. And when you get to a particularly small scale, the mass that you conjure out of nothing is so big and so concentrated that it immediately collapses to form a black hole. So scales smaller than this, we can't even say anything about. We know that our physics actually breaks down, and we need what we call a quantum theory of gravity to guide us beyond.
David Hearn. Could general relativity and quantum theory be separate entities?
That's yet another interesting question. The history of physics has shown us that we've been able to unify disparate bits of physics. So, for instance, in the 19th century, James Clerk Maxwell, the Scottish physicist, was able to show that electricity and magnetism could be unified in a single framework. And increasingly, in the 20th century, we've been able to unify more and more bits of physics. But there is a fundamental incompatibility between quantum theory and general relativity. These are the two towering achievements of 20th century physics. Quantum theory is fundamentally a theory about uncertainty. We can never know the particular path that a particle will travel along, only the probability of it going along one path or another path. Yet general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, is a theory of certainty. We can know the path of a planet exactly. So a lot of people have wondered whether these are so incompatible that they cannot be reconciled. However, there have been indications recently that they might be. And this has come as a huge surprise for everyone. It turns out that non-locality, you may have heard of, this is a weird quantum phenomenon of spooky action at a distance. Quantum particles can actually influence each other over very large distances. Distances greater than a light beam could actually cover. And this non-locality is it's thought that it could knit together space-time to make the space-time the smooth space-time of Einstein's theory of gravity. So it's looking as if it might be possible to unite these two theories. But of course, it's also possible that they are incompatible. As humans, we like to unify everything into a seamless whole, but it could be that nature is fundamentally messy.
Richard Type. Could you compare and contrast the Newtonian and Einsteinian views of gravity?
Well, Newton assumed that the source of gravity was mass. He also assumed that the speed of gravity was infinite, because basically he just declared in his theory that gravity fell off with distance in a particular manner. Basically, he was saying that it would be felt instantaneously everywhere and it had an infinite speed. However, Einstein in 1905, with his special theory of relativity, showed two things. He showed that energy, or mass, is a form of energy, the most concentrated form of energy, and that nothing could travel faster than the speed of light. So he needed to incorporate these two ideas into his own theory of gravity of 1915, which was the general theory of relativity. And in that theory, energy is the actual source of gravity, not mass, and gravity does indeed propagate at the speed of light and not at infinite speed. And what this theory shows is that gravity is in fact the curvature or the warpage of space-time caused by energy, caused by most commonly mass energy. And whereas Newton had postulated the existence of a force, almost like an invisible tether that connected the sun to the earth and kept the earth moving around the sun, Einstein showed that this was untrue. And in fact, what the sun did was warp the space-time around it, create a valley around it, and the earth moved along the only possible path it could do, kind of rolling around the upper slopes of the valley like a roulette ball in a roulette wheel. So in fact, Einstein's theory shows there is no force at all on the earth, and the earth is just basically following its natural path through warped space-time.
Andy Simmons, can you explain the laws of thermodynamics in plain English?
Well, that's quite a challenge. Basically, energy can be used to do work. This is something useful like drive a car or power a washing machine, but there is always a cost. We can never convert energy into work with 100% efficiency. We always produce heat. Heat is disordered motion, disordered microscopic motion, the motion of atoms flying around randomly. And this is disorder, which physicists call entropy. And the second law of thermodynamics tells us that entropy never decreases. In fact, it pretty much always increases. Now, I can give you some insight into why disorder increases and why there is actually a direction of time with an example. One of the puzzles of physics is that the fundamental laws are time symmetric. So, for instance, an atom can spit out a photon of light, but it can also suck in a photon of light. It can do the opposite. And yet when we look at the everyday world around us, it is not time symmetric. People grow old, they do not grow young. Cups break, they do not unbreak. Castles crumble, they do not uncrumble. So how do these time symmetric fundamental laws end up producing this asymmetric universe in which we live? Well, imagine a teacup which you drop and break. Now, the teacup can break in many different ways. So, for instance, it could break into one big chunk and 3 small chunks. It could break into 12 big chunks and 52 small chunks and a lot of dust. And you can quickly realise that there are a very large number of different ways that the teacup can break. But crucially, there's only one way it can be intact. So if all these possibilities are equally probable, then it's overwhelmingly likely that the teacup goes from being intact to being broken, because there are just more possibilities, more possible ways it can be broken. It's possible that all the broken chunks could leap up in the air and remake an intact teacup, but that's very unlikely because there's only one possibility. And you'd have to wait many times the age of the universe to see that actually happen. But you can see that the broken shards of the teacup are a disordered state. So you can see that it's overwhelmingly likely that we go from order to disorder. And this is in fact what the universe is doing. Obviously it's being defied in some places, so life is building more and more order, but it does that only by exporting disorder to its environment. So overall entropy does not decrease. But if entropy is always increasing, that tells us that entropy or disorder must have been less in the past. Now we know the universe began in a Big Bang, when all of the energy, matter and space was concentrated in the tiniest of regions, which then erupted into a titanic explosion. So if entropy is always increasing, it tells us that the Big Bang must have been a low entropy state. It must have been very ordered, it must have been special. Now that is very worrying to physicists. So if you imagine a balloon that is inflated, it's inflated because there are countless quadrillion molecules flying around like a swarm of angry bees inside that balloon and pounding on the membrane of the balloon and keeping it inflated. Now if all those molecules were all in one tiny location in the balloon and nowhere else, obviously the balloon would collapse, but that would be unbelievably unlikely that that would actually happen. So if we transfer that thought to the Big Bang, then we are talking about an unbelievably unlikely state in the Big Bang. So why the universe started out in such a special state is one of the great mysteries of cosmology.